So,
Hi, everybody.
so people are watching on YouTube as well?
Yep, we have a YouTube live stream for people who want to observe, but not necessarily speak up. But we have our folks who are joining us live via Zoom coming in. So it's nice to see you all. Thank you for joining us for this, what I think should be a great discussion of a film that I can't express sufficiently how highly I think of this film. I think it is truly one of the great American motion pictures, and I am so glad that we were able to discuss it today, and that we had that wonderful instructive introduction from Amy Corbin, who's joining us. Hi, Amy.
Okay. Hello, everyone.
And I look forward to our wonderful discussion this evening. So thank you all for joining us. Those of you who might be new to joining us this evening, would just please pay attention to the slide on your screen now, how to participate. We would ask you to please keep your audio muted until I call on you for your question or comment. I will know to call on you because you can use the little raise hand function right there on this illustration. At that point, please unmute yourself and share your question or comment. We also, as you know, have the chat function in Zoom, and we would encourage you to introduce yourselves in that. If you, particularly if you're from outside the greater Philadelphia area, we would love to hear from you. And if you want to drop us a bit of a longer line about how you found us or how you think we're doing, or to let us know where you're from exactly, please visit the Where in the World section of the Film Studies Online page at brynmarfilm.org. You can also, in the chat, obviously discuss the film amongst yourselves and raise some other issues. And my colleague Jill is on the line to let us know about any major points of discussion that come up via the chat. But other than that, I think we are just about ready to get started. So we will get going with one of our usual first callers, probably our most frequent first participant, David. How are you tonight, David?
Good evening. I am great. And before I comment a little bit on some of Amy's thoughts and the movie, Andrew, one of the things that this movie was particularly, or I guess I became adept because of some of the things that you have taught us over the last 10 months, is that I was very, very aware that I was watching the movie in 2 time frames. And you've taught us in the past, talked about, watching movies and thinking about the dates, the years that they had come out. So I guess part of my thought and comment is how amazingly appropriate it is, not just because it's Martin Luther King weekend, and not just because it's a great thought-provoking piece, but because of where we are with what occurred in Washington and what occurred this past summer, and how looking at this from today and 30-ish years ago when it came out is so appealing in one way and troubling, I guess, in the other way. And realizing that as I'm watching this, and my son-in-law, who has seen this several times, quizzed me over the weekend after I had seen it, to make sure that I was looking at it, and especially those last 8 or 10 minutes, looking at it from each of the different points of view, both black and white, and the different individuals. And I guess both of you, but Amy, if you would sort of talk about that issue of the different views that Spike Lee puts into that group of scenes especially. And thank you. A great movie. Janice and I have not seen a lot of Spike Lee. We will certainly watch more of it now. I think you've opened our eyes in many ways. So thank you, and take off with your conversation, please.
Well, thanks for that, David. Amy, you heard David's comments, and he was hoping that you in particular could speak a little more about the way some different perspectives are depicted or represented in the sort of climactic moments of the film. Did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely. And I think I'll back up for a minute from the climax and just talk about the diversity in general in the film, and then sort of how it comes to a climax. So, I think one of the things that makes the film so durable and have so many layers to it, but especially remarkable for 1989 when it came out, is that, there is not a Black point of view and a white point of view, right? So we obviously have other races also, right? We have sort of, white ethnic identities and Puerto Ricans, but even if you just take the African-American characters, I think Lee very pointedly has people of all different ages, right? So you've got mother, sister, and a mayor who represent this older generation. And people have sort of heard it in their voices and the way they talk, the sort of roots of the Southern African-American experience. And then, of course, so many people in the 20th, African-Americans in the 20th century having moved northward to cities. So he sort of introduces that, what we now call the Great Migration, and he doesn't do it officially, but he just has those characters standing for that generation of experiences. And then, of course, you've got sort of, middle-aged people and younger people and kids and, excuse me. So you have that in terms of generations, but also in terms of worldviews, like Mookie's sister, be a good worker, be disciplined, show up on time, be respectful. So she's sort of espousing a particular like middle-class idea about what it means to be a good employee. We've got people who are unemployed. We've got the corner men, right, who are sitting around seemingly unemployed, but commenting on everybody else and why everybody else is doing what they're doing. Musically, right, you've got just, a complete mix of all different genres. So the whole movie, I think, it's impossible to stay with just one perspective because you are seeing so many different voices, hearing things, both vocally and musically, and you're traveling with Mookie, who is a sort of, kind of traveler through the neighborhood, and is able to, on our behalf, take us into apartments and to different places on the sidewalk or on the street and have all of these really different interactions. And so, so I think, because of that, then as you get to the climax, you have these really different attitudes about, what does it mean to damage property? Is that symbolic, revolution, right? Is that making a statement that is going to maybe tell the rest of the world that this neighborhood is in distress, right? Or is it foolish? Is it dangerous? Is it going to hurt people, right? So you've got, mother sister who seemed pretty gentle for most of the movie, right? And then at the end, burn it down, she's screaming. And so, I think that's sort of the culmination of all of these different points of view where the characters are representing different experiences, generationally, economically, and just sort of philosophically, right? Like, what are ways that people should get along, or what are ways that people should handle conflict with each other? And so then I would actually be interested in maybe extending the question back to some of you in terms of Mookie, right? Like, so Mookie himself sort of holds all these different ideas and points of view that are sometimes clashing in his head. And I'm curious what you all saw him doing at the end. So thinking both of the, throwing the trash can through the window, but also what you might call the coda or the postscript, that very kind of weird, quiet scene that happens after the violence, where he sees Sal the next morning. And so anyway, that's kind of a long question, I guess, but I'm curious what people think about sort of how Mookie himself represents some different points of view, and then what you make of the actions that he takes towards the end of the film.
Well, I think you raised a number of great points there, Amy, and I think one of the most important ones is one that so often gets lost in movies and in society at large, which is that people may have certain qualities that would make some inclined to lump them together, whether it is their nationality or their religion or the color of their skin, but that does not mean that they are monolithic ideologically or politically or morally or any of that. And I think that it's one of the significant accomplishments of the film, that you can have a movie with so many different characters from so many different walks of life and backgrounds. And within those different backgrounds, you have differing perspectives, sometimes significantly, sometimes subtly. And to balance all that, and yet still give us a sense that these are real people and that they have some connection to the world that we're all living in a movie that is just barely more than 2 hours. It's really a storytelling, a filmmaking, a character accomplishment. The other thing I wanted to say in response to your comments and David's are that I listened to a little bit of audio commentary on the film from Spike Lee, and he says very clearly that you know, basically he sort of says people assume that I have a fondness for all of the characters I play because I'm playing them and I wrote them and I'm the filmmaker. He said, but that's not true. He said, I have no trouble playing flawed characters, unlikable characters. And he said, Mookie's not, Mookie's not the best guy in the world. He talks about how he doesn't really seem to take great responsibility or care for his son. He talks about how he sort of seems to go from job to job, the way his sister sort of scolds him. And in a sense, his sister's voice, since he's the screenwriter, his sister's voice in the film is as much his voice as any of the voices, right? Even though she's sort of chastising Mookie. So, he's willing to have a spectrum of opinions, even within, the seeming protagonist and character that he himself plays. And I just think it's a testament to his skill as a filmmaker and the different roles he played in the making of this film, that it comes out so well. And I don't mean the story, I mean the film. Joss, you have a question or comment?
There is so much to talk about in this film, so I want to focus on Spike Lee as a filmmaker. I mean, I had seen his first released film before, came out before this, She's Gotta Have It, which was very good, but had this not quite fully established, he had not yet fully established himself as a filmmaker. And this one really, and Do the Right Thing just did it. I mean, it is so skillful, so elegantly constructed in terms of the characters, which have already been discussed, the illusion that there's no plot, but it does build to that climax in spite of that. His reference to other films and other genres, the Radio Raheem's Jewelry, the love-hate stuff, from Night of the Hunter.
Night of the Hunter, yeah.
I wonder if there are, again, I didn't catch any others of that sort, but that one was pretty, that one just hit me over the head. And the three guys in front of the red wall, and Sam Jackson's character as and my wife suggested this as a Greek chorus, which is perfect. I mean, this was a Greek tragedy. This just had this sense of inevitability about where it was going and how horribly it was going to end. And it was just so beautifully done. And thinking in retrospect to Spike Lee's other films, this isn't the only thing he does. I mean, he's made a caper film, Inside Man, which barely touched on any of the themes that you think of him as highlighting in most of his films. He made, that epic biopic about Malcolm X. I mean, he's just such a skilled filmmaker. Anyway, those were some of the thoughts I had watching this incredible film again 30 years after it came out. And when I saw that this was going to be the film, I said, oh, great, we're seeing a new film. And then I realized that this is 30 years old. And then watching it, I said, this could be a new film. It's so contemporary. Anyway, those were all the thoughts I had about this, and just wonder if anybody has any comments about it.
Thanks, Joss. Oh, yeah, Amy, go ahead.
Oh, I was I was taking a lot of notes on what you said. You said a lot of really insightful things. But I wanted, since we were talking about sort of Spike Lee's point of view, as the writer director versus the character he plays, and you brought up this this idea of the cornermen as being a Greek chorus, which I think is definitely part of what they're supposed to do. But there's also part of me that wonders if those are Spike Lee's voices, because those three men are debating entrepreneurship. Why don't we own our own businesses? Why is it the Korean American couple, running the convenience store and the Italian American family running the pizzeria? And, some of the guys are like, people are just lazy, and other people are like, no, we're not given the, we don't have the opportunities. We don't have the financial capital to do this. And Spike Lee himself is very entrepreneurial, right? And that's how he got his first few films made, selling merchandise and just sort of, having a very word of mouth type approach to publicity and being in the neighborhood, and so then you've got his store in the neighborhood where you can buy the baseball caps and t-shirts and stuff like that. And so his relationship to Hollywood as a business, right, is very similar to Mookie in a way, where he's sort of navigating the people that control the capital that can allow him to make the movies, and then also trying to make his own opportunities. And so I think he doesn't have one opinion about maybe, why the neighborhood doesn't have Black-owned businesses. Like, I feel like those men are almost like an internal conversation maybe that Lee is having about the place of entrepreneurship and small business ownership and owning property, as it relates to African-American urban life.
Yeah, one of the things Lee said in that commentary I heard was that he actually kind of agreed with what Sal says when he says, it's my business. I'm going to decide who goes on the wall. When you have your business, you put on the walls who you want. And Spike Lee says, as someone who has, tried to have control over his own business and his own films and all that, I completely agree with it. That should be a big motivation, he said, within African American communities to want to start those businesses. And so he it's another example where it's not just the character he plays, let alone African American characters who are saying what the filmmaker himself, happens to think on a particular topic. The other thing I want to mention is regarding other influences. I think the Love and Hate speech that was an homage clearly to Night of the Hunter was one of them. As many people know, Spike Lee went to NYU Film School. He was certainly aware of and influenced by the films of Martin Scorsese. I think you can see that not in him copying specific techniques, but in the energy and movement his camera has at certain points in the film. It has a lot more of force and pointed direction than a lot of filmmakers tend to use, but Scorsese certainly uses it. I know that he used Frank Vincent, who's the Italian American man who's driving the convertible down the street when the hydrants open, who's in a lot of Scorsese films, and Lee said he'd seen him in some Scorsese film and knew that he would be good for that part. I also happen to think, and I have no firsthand knowledge of this, but a number of years ago, I saw a film, and I believe I'm remembering the film right, My Beautiful Laundrette with Daniel Day-Lewis, which is also about, in some ways, the inability of marginalized people to sort of break through and achieve the status that they should have. And that film too has a climactic destruction of a business, that there were shots in the way that was filmed in that film that reminded me of the way, of the climactic moments of Do the Right Thing. And I think it's possible, that film came out earlier in the 80s. I think it's possible that Lee might have seen that and taken some inspiration from that. But he's an extremely knowledgeable filmmaker and actually attended film school, as I said. So I'm certain some folks will notice other references as well.
Yeah,
Anna, you have
I actually,
oh, I'm sorry, Amy, go ahead.
oh, just super quick on the sort of film historical references. One of the articles that I often teach with this film, when I teach it in my survey of international film history, makes particular links between this and the Italian neorealist movement and the French New Wave. And so if you're familiar with, so neorealism is very much about location shooting and the day-to-day lives of ordinary people, usually people with low income, and sometimes not a lot happens, and it's just sort of about like, here's the camera and here's life. And the French New Wave sort of jumps on that in a way through location shooting and sometimes not a lot happening, but the techniques become much more stylized. And so you've got strange camera angles, or you've got jump cuts and things like that. And I think you can absolutely see that blend, which is one of the things that continues to fascinate me about the film, is that it's both realistic and allegorical at the same time, and it somehow manages to balance a sense of really being in this Bed-Stuy neighborhood, but also sometimes you feel like you're watching like a theater production, in terms of the color scheme and the canted angles and stuff like that. So I just want to throw that in terms of, it's not a particular film history reference, but it's kind of a way I think that Lee is participating in an ongoing film conversation that's happening through these different movements.
And he breaks a lot of rules of even forget classical Hollywood, of even 1980s Hollywood cinema in terms of the film language he uses. There's a lot of direct address. There's a lot of moments of sort of commentary and pause within the film. There's a lot of vignettes that in some way seem kind of removed from the main narrative or a bit apart from the main narrative. And he's not afraid to identify them as such. And I think that, the French New Wave in particular was a movement that introduced, or at least made acceptable to American audiences and American filmmakers, a lot of departures from what had been the classical Hollywood style that maintained strict narrative continuity at all costs. And so he clearly felt some liberation to do that. I would also say that I think, there's a tendency, and there may be truth to it, I'm not in a position to say, there's a tendency to say that that this film has a significant element of oral storytelling in it, and that is in some way connected to African-American history and heritage. And that may be the case. I'm not really in a position to say that. But what I can say is that I would be shocked if in his film school education, Spike Lee hadn't seen Citizen Kane, which is a film that is, of course, told to us as we watch it, or that he hadn't seen Magnificent Ambersons that has townspeople commenting on the goings on at different points throughout it. And he does something totally different with those sort of tendencies or inclinations. I mean, he takes them to places that Wells never thought of and couldn't have gotten away with in 1940s Hollywood. But the notion that there's more than one way to tell a story, there's more than one way to engage with an audience, is, I think, something that Lee is able to really make the most of in this movie, in part because he is so informed from his study and appreciation of films from the past.
Andrew, I think you may have just explained why Citizen Kane and Do the Right Thing are among my two favorite films. And I have not really thought of them together until this very moment. But I think that idea of these multiple perspectives, almost in a kaleidoscope kind of form is why I can watch both of those films over and over again and not get bored.
I agree. Sorry for the delay, Anna. You have a question or comment?
Yeah, thank you so much. So I was wondering what you made of the character of Smiley, specifically in his racial identity and his identity as a disabled person, because the actor who plays Smiley is a Black man, Roger Guenver-Smith, but throughout the movie, and I could be mistaken, he passes or presents as a white man. So I was wondering, I've always been really fascinated by this character, especially his position in the climactic moment of the film where he finally is able to place his postcard on the wall of the burning pizza shop. So I was just wondering what you made of that, especially given that he's, I guess the only disabled character in the film, and one of the yeah.
Okay, thanks for that, Anna. I will say for myself that I never took his character as being depicted as being white. And I hadn't really thought about the possibility of him being multiracial. I had always thought of him, and perhaps it's because I've seen Roger Guenver-Smith in other films where I think he's playing, in many cases, African-American characters. I never thought of his character as anything but African-American. But I suppose that possibility exists. I can't think of an instance in the film where other characters identify him as white, but I may be wrong about that. Amy, do you have thoughts on that, on the character of Smiley?
I do, and I think your observation is really fascinating because in my experience teaching the film to, I teach at Muhlenberg College, which is a predominantly white institution. So I'm teaching, mostly white students. And they often think that he's white. So, I think that perception, I don't know, I guess I don't want to too wildly speculate, but maybe I can say this because I also identify as a white person, that I think maybe if you're white and you grow up, in a mostly white environment, you're maybe not aware of how much multiracial identities are in the African-American community. And so if somebody, looks fairly light-skinned, then it seems like a lot of my students just assume he's white. But I agree with Andrew. I don't think that the characters in the film think he's white. I don't think he's supposed to be white. I think he's just supposed to be a light-skinned African-American man. But students do that all the time. So that's, I think, my first really kind of major comment about Smiley. And I don't think it was on purpose. I do know that role was not originally in the screenplay. And the actor went to Spike Lee and said, I really, really want to be in your film. Can you make a part for me? Which is interesting because, of course, the part ends up being so symbolic. But I don't have any idea whether or not, casting somebody who was light-skinned was intentional. But I do think it does have the effect of just bringing up more of this sort of multiple identities that we've been talking about, right? So that not only do you have differences in class and generation and attitude about work, but you also just have people who look different from each other, but they all identify as being part of this community. So then, obviously Smiley is holding this photo that becomes symbolic for this polarization between sort of the ideology of Martin Luther King and the ideology of Malcolm X, and this photo being this time that they came together. It seems, this is one part of the film that, like, it almost seems cliche if I say, this person with disability is almost like, the savant. He sort of represents like the major philosophical dilemma of the film, and yet he's disabled, and so people don't take him seriously. That's kind of almost seems like a cliche in terms of a character type, right? That the person who maybe is not as intellectually or can't express themselves vocally as well as everybody else somehow has almost like a deeper understanding. But it's kind of hard to not escape. It's kind of hard, to not think about it that way, because of the sort of omnipresence of this photograph that he is around. Yeah, I just looking at the chat window, talking a little bit like a sort of prophetic character. but then I think the film is also asking us to undo a binary between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, right? And I think I alluded to that a little bit in my introduction, that they're often, seen as polarizing, and it's like one or the other. And I think it's pretty clear from the film that Spike Lee doesn't want us to think that there's just one answer. And so I don't know, having that then be represented by this guy who kind of doesn't have an agenda in the neighborhood. He's not one of the people that's trying to get a job or not wanting to get a job or getting in fights with people. He's just kind of like this wandering person that everybody accepts. So I don't know. So that's not a totally conclusive answer, but those are some thoughts.
I mean, I think it's interesting, and this was sort of alluded to in the chat as well, that there are all these sorts of, and I don't mean this as critical in the way it's probably going to sound, because this word is almost always used critically, but the film has a number of didactic elements, and it does a lot of things to make those didactic elements more cinematic and more dynamic. And Mr. Senior Love Daddy is one of them. Those three guys in front of the wall are another. And I think Smiley is another, that Lee wants to make this point about just what Amy was saying about King and X, and we know that because he puts the two sort of quotations from them at the end of the film. And so he has this character that forces us to slow down and stop and think and try to listen, as the sort of person, bringing these two men and the ideologies they represent to the fore within the film. And I have to believe that's intentional, that there was something about, wanting to make the audience pause and think in a film that has a lot of energy and a lot of dynamism and a lot of different perspectives, pause on these two. Having him do that, might have been a choice to facilitate that.
Yeah. Super interesting.
Lawrence, you have a question or comment? Okay, we can go on to Diane then. Diane, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you assigned this film. I hadn't seen it before. I had seen Black Klansman, which I really enjoyed, and The Five Bloods, which also was great. Also has some didactic elements in it. But I went to the New York Times. They reevaluated this movie again, and there was a comment from one of their readers about Rosie Perez and how she felt somewhat exploited in this film, that when Spike Lee had ice cubes on her nipples, you didn't see her face, she said, because she was crying. So again, this was 1989. And maybe women didn't have the same voice in saying what they will or would not do. But if you could comment on the role of women and Rosie in particular. Thanks.
That's the first I've heard of this story or this incident, and I know that a lot of people. This is the first film that she was in, to my knowledge, and that she was initially hired to do the choreography and to perform in the opening sequence. And then I think Lee said in his commentary anyway that he thought it was important to have Mookie somehow have a connection to the people of Puerto Rican heritage, because, as he said, that there were a lot of African Americans and Puerto Rican neighborhoods that are are mixes of those cultures, and also there's a lot of marriage between people from those groups, and he thought that that was a very sort of, that rang true to the era in New York City, in that era in particular. But I wasn't aware of this. It's a very disturbing revelation, if it's true, and I think, unfortunately, probably, you know, she's probably not the only or the first person to have been put in an unfortunate and uncomfortable and deeply upsetting situation on a film set. I think that there have been steps taken within the filmmaking community to try to avoid or minimize such things since, you know, over the last 30 years. But unfortunately, if it's true, I'm sure it's not an isolated incident. I hadn't heard of this, though. Amy, had you heard of this?
Yeah, I have. And it may be from the same source, the same New York Times source. I can't remember, but I know that in reviewing my notes and articles for the introduction, I do remember rereading that. And yeah, I have to, the articles in the chat. Thank you. It's one of the things I love about Zooming and chatting. People can look things up and submit links and things like that. But
thank
yeah,
you, thank you, Anna, for sending that link in the chat. Yeah. Anyone can find it there. I'm sorry, Amy, go ahead.
Oh, it's okay. So yeah, I mean, I think up until very recently, right? I mean, like now there are intimacy coordinators, or they have, you know, various job titles on film sets that are actually running through with the actors, and particularly the women, you know, what they're going to be comfortable with and what they're not, and how to make it more comfortable. And, you know, at what point does something, if it becomes too intense, it gets stopped. But that's pretty recent. I don't know for sure, but I would be very, very surprised if Spike Lee in 1989 was thinking about that. And, you know, Spike Lee has come under some criticism for his treatment of women characters, which is interesting given that his first film, somebody mentioned, you know, She's Gotta Have It, is in some ways pretty feminist, because it's about this woman who's very much in charge of her sexuality, and she's got these different men that are all sort of vying for her attention, and she's almost like, you know, the queen bee who gets to choose who she's going to hang out with. And so in some ways that seems rather feminist, but there are issues with that film that people have pointed out, and I think a lot of the other films that come from Lee are very masculine centered, and so the women are not given as many three-dimensional roles. And I think that it's unfortunate, in particular with the Rosie Perez character, because, like Andrew said, I think it's really a big part of Lee's purpose is to show the demographics of these New York neighborhoods that he was so familiar with, that include African American, Puerto Rican, Korean American, Italian American, right? I mean, all the ethnic and racial groups that are represented. You know, he really was trying to show the ways in which they're intertwined, but also in which they may struggle to live together. And so there's some other great scenes that Rosie Perez's character is in, and that she allows, you know, us to see as viewers, you know, in terms of the whole parenting of the baby that they have together, right? And, like, you know, what language is the baby going to be spoken to, and, you know, things like that are very real in interracial, interlinguistic, intercultural relationships. So, you know, I think her character does some really valuable work in terms of what Spike Lee wants to show of the culture of the neighborhood. So it's really unfortunate that one scene, you know, left her feeling so exploited. And I feel like it's exploitative when I watch it, frankly. It makes me feel really uncomfortable. So, you know, Spike Lee, like a lot of male filmmakers, I think, is probably just, you know, he certainly in 1989, I think, was not attuned to how that would come across. You know, and then that makes me think of the prologue, right? Is her, you know, her extremely aggressive and very symbolic dancing, which, you know, to me, I mean, I love the prologue because it sets the stage. Literally, it looks like a theater stage, you know, like everything is lit in such a way that it looks like a sound stage and not a real street. The music, of course, the Public Enemy song is introducing one of the main themes of the film, and her dancing is, you know, just full of anger and aggression, and it to me, it's so perfectly sets the stage for the rest of the film. But at the same time, like, if you want to talk about the choreography, you know, you could argue that that also is, I mean, a male dancer wouldn't have been dancing like that, right? So, you know, there is something very, very much about the female body that comes out in that prologue, even though, again, I think symbolically it is so important for the film. So yeah, so I guess I would say that, you know, that perhaps is one of Spike Lee's blind spots. And one of the things that our culture now in 2021, I think, is finally, we're sort of catching up to, the way that some of the you know, female actors are treated in Hollywood, when there's these power dynamics that are so different, right? And she's a pretty young, you know, young actress at the time, and she gets this opportunity, and probably doesn't feel like she can say no. And there's many other women in Hollywood that have been in that position.
She, it was her first film. She was, to this point, known as a dancer and choreographer, and I'm pretty sure she choreographed the opening performance. So I will say, though, that she obviously didn't shoot it and didn't edit it. So in terms of any sort of objectification, some of that could have come via the filming and editing. But in terms of the movement, I believe that originated with her, and I think it, you know, I think it's an important element of the film, both for its message, as well as to give us a sense of the time in which it was made. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things we're all sort of re-evaluating in light of recent events and changes. Absolutely. Ken, you have a question or comment?
Okay. I was wondering what the people's opinion were, I guess, about how Sal came across at the end. Because throughout the whole movie, he seemed to be someone who was kind of in sync with the neighborhood. He'd been there for many years. He took pride in the fact that all these people grew up eating his pizza, and was, you know, he would temper the anger of his sons, and he knew how to get along, and was very happy being in a neighborhood that a lot of people might not wanted to have been in. And then all of a sudden, he lost it in that climactic scene where he started yelling at the, you know, using the N-word and calling them different things. And to me, it was out of character with what we had seen of him throughout the rest of the movie. And I didn't know what people's reaction is. Are they feeling like that's really what he felt and he was just covering up all these times? Or was it that the emotions of what was going on brought this out in him?
Thanks for that, Ken. Yeah, I find that to be a, you know, in some ways it's a real sort of disappointment. I mean, this is a movie and these are characters, but someone who seemed to be, you know, certainly more open to engaging with African Americans than was the stereotype by and large of the film, and then was the sort of, you know, then the news of the time and what had gone on in Bensonhurst and the incident that inspired this film would suggest. It was a real, you know, sort of, in a way, a disappointment to see him do that, but not a disappointment in the film, a disappointment in that person, if that were a real person. But of course, he's a character, and that's there. That change, that revelation is there for a reason. And I think that we're not intended to know entirely whether, you know, he was putting on a show for most of the film and then his true colors came out, or whether he was in the crucible of that confrontation that came out. But the reality is that, you know, that was obviously within his grasp to say and to try to use in a confrontation. And I think that's intentional, and that tells us something about the character. Amy, what are your thoughts on that?
So yeah, so I think that Sal is perhaps the most complicated character in the film, which is interesting, right? Since it is largely a film about an African American neighborhood, and I think Lee deliberately makes Sal likable, but with this sort of undercurrent of subconscious racism. And I'm looking in the chat window, and I think William says something like that, that Sal represents the underlying racism that is in some white people that appear to me non-racist. I think that is exactly what's going on. And so, if you watch the film multiple times, there are various moments where he sounds affectionate but a little bit condescending, about the people in the neighborhood. He sees himself as a sort of father figure. He treats Mookie's sister Jade in a little bit of a condescending way, and he's sort of got his rules, and things need to happen a certain way. And as long as everyone behaves in the pizza parlor, then everybody gets along. But, I think he does have an underlying and maybe subconscious, maybe not aware of it, but a sort of underlying feeling of superiority. And so I don't think it's a complete character change. I think the idea is that under the surface, everybody in the neighborhood has anger about either, particular things that have happened to them or judgments about groups of people. It's all there, right? And the point is, of course, that the heat and the noise and everything sort of finally brings everybody out, brings their emotions out. And I wondered also, sort of thinking about characters that seem to change. Also in the chat, somebody had asked about Mother's sister, who I had mentioned earlier also, who seems very gentle, and then she has this burn it down, and then the crying. And so maybe we could bundle these together and talk a little bit about characters not necessarily making abrupt changes, but in what ways are they showing just different sides of themselves, right? And at one moment, one side sort of rises to the top and something else is submerged, and then at a different moment, what's submerged ends up coming out. So I wonder if anybody has any thoughts about that with any of the characters, Sal, Mother, Sister, or Mookie.
Well, I mean, Emily makes a very brief, but I think thoughtful statement in the chat. She says Sal represents tolerance within limits, but not equality. And I think that's, again, the film is trying to show us a range of beliefs, opinions, moralities within a range of people. And at one point, I get the names of the two sons confused, but the son who's not John Turturro actually goes out with Mookie on one of his deliveries, and Mookie runs into bugging out during that, and he says no, he's don't talk to him like that, he's down or whatever. And I think that within that family, Lee's trying to show us that even within that family, that there's a spectrum of comfort with, acceptance of, views of equality towards African Americans. And I think that that moment toward the end of the film, I think, puts Aiello in between the two sons on that sort of spectrum, right? He may have seemed to be firmly with the one who wasn't John Turturro, but, he's a little further away from that than we thought at the end. And, there's something to be said for, people being judged by how they act in a crisis, right? It's when things are going well, it's easy to do the right thing, right? And things weren't going well at that moment, and he did more than not the right thing. I think it was a thoughtful choice, and one that you can imagine was probably one of the things Paramount didn't care for. I found that point in your introduction very instructive, because it's in many ways, it's an uncompromising film and not something you would think a studio would make. And I thought maybe I had to reevaluate my view of Hollywood studios, but I was a bit comforted to realize that no, at least one of them was not interested in the film as it was written. So I felt my assessment of their boldness was was a bit more accurate.
Yeah, I would be
Yeah, go
super
ahead.
interested to know. I haven't researched, but I'd be super interested to know that the one head of the studio that Lee praised for being so open-minded, like I would be really interested to know, what else has he done, and did he have that attitude a lot? But anyway, that's a side topic. One thing to say about Sal also is that, again, my experience teaching this film with largely white students, is that students seem much more upset about Sal's pizzeria being burned down than they do about Radio Raheem being killed. And Lee has said that also in interviews. And he has said, a lot of white people come up to me and they're so upset about Sal's pizzeria being burned down. And so, my take on it is that, in a way, Lee has challenged those of us who are not African American to, on the one hand, we have this pretty sympathetic white character for most of the film, right? That he does seem to be certainly more open-minded than his older son, Pino. And I always remember in alphabetical order. I forever was trying to come up with a mnemonic device. So it's Pino's the older one, the more racist, and Vito is the one that Mookie kind of hangs out with. But anyway, so for most of the film, Sal, right, does seem very, very sympathetic. And even when he's not, he's dimensional, right? We understand, like, okay, he has put a lot of, of sweat and money and hours of time into building this business. So yeah, he's kind of a jerk about, the wall, but, as a three-dimensional person, that makes sense. Now, Radio Raheem, on the other hand, is like about as flat as you can be in terms of character development, right? Like, it's not like we have any idea his backstory, his motivation, why does he do anything? And so my take is that that's deliberate, right? That that we're being tested in a way as an audience, in particular, whoever's watching who's not African American. I think that we're being tested a bit. Why would we care more about the destruction of the pizza parlor, than we would about, or why would it sort of, I don't even want to say care more about, but I feel like when students talk about this movie, that's what they want to talk about, like, why was the pizza parlor burned down? And they get to that question and they have more feelings about that than they do about Radio Raheem being strangled, right? Which is just kind of astonishing. But I think it's actually very clever filmmaking, because I think it makes us question, well, yeah, so Radio Raheem, he was kind of annoying. I mean, a lot of people in the neighborhood, including a lot of the Black residents, were annoyed that he was playing his same song over and over again so loudly, right? But obviously that does not in any way excuse what happened to him. So I think Lee is kind of saying, like, it doesn't matter if Radio Raheem was a nice guy or not, right? This is just wrong. But he makes it more challenging for some audience members to get to that point because he constructs Sal with such depth, and sort of really makes him someone you can identify with.
And that's a really good point, because Lee does test the audience. He does sort of, in a way, stack the deck, because it's not only, I mean, there should be no question, right? A life versus property, the life is the bigger deal. Absolutely. But not only is there the difference that you just mentioned, Amy, but it also has to do with when the events occur and how the film is sort of constructed and edited, right? Radio Raheem is grabbed and choked and ultimately killed, while, at the tail end of this conflagration, with a lot of noise, a lot of people, a lot of movement, and a lot of relatively fast editing. And it seems like the noise level has gone down, the camera movement has gone down, the duration of shots has gotten longer, so the edits have gotten slower. And then Mookie seems to make an intentional, measured, rational decision to set off what happens to the pizzeria. And I think that is, you talked about as a filmmaker sort of testing the audience. That's another part of that test, that he has given us some, as a filmmaker, he's given us some signals that the conflict has, it's not right what happened, but the conflagration has cooled, in terms of the stylistic choices as a filmmaker. But of course it hasn't yet. And I think that the fact that we have been, as viewers, conditioned to think that we are in the calm when Mookie does what he does is another thing that sort of, adds to that challenge you were mentioning.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, about the sort of the way it's slowed down. So do we want to talk a little bit about Mookie's choice and what we think about, why, again, he's not a person, he's a character who has a function in a story. What do we think that function is, and or what were you all thinking about the scene with him and Sal afterwards?
Well, I would love to hear what people think about that. We also have a few folks who've had their hands up for a while, so maybe folks could think about Amy's really good question while we hear what some other folks might have to say in the meantime. Ben, did you have a comment or question you've been wanting to state?
Yeah. So I was just curious. So this film is obviously, I've loved it a lot. And universally, I think pretty much everybody I've met or talked to really likes this film. Critically, it's very well loved. But why do you think when it came out, it wasn't initially, given any love by the Academy, or, it was kind of divisive out of Cannes, you said? Why do you think that was compared to now, when I would say it's generally considered a classic?
Thanks for that, Ben. Amy, go ahead.
Oh, if you wanted to say something first, I didn't want to cut you off.
No, please go ahead.
So historically, right, in the late 1980s, we have, what was called the crack epidemic, rising rates of crime, both drug related and otherwise, and the white flight to the suburbs, in the decades leading up to that. So we have this sort of all these, abandoned buildings and houses, and some real, historians and historical geographers look back on it and talk really a lot about sort of an anti-urban sentiment at this point in time. And of course, that's linked to race, right? So that African Americans, people of color in general, but African Americans in particular, were linked to urban life at this time, in a way that maybe they still are, but I think it's a lot more nuanced now. But at this point, a lot of times when people said urban, they meant Black. And so there was sort of in the mainstream press, I think, a lot of paranoia and really sort of building up people's anxiety about, like, the cities are in crisis and the cities are dangerous and all of this. And so then you have Lee, and then a couple of years later, you've got, John Singleton coming out with Boys in the Hood, New Jack City, directed by Mario Van Peebles. So these are a couple of movies from the early 1990s that were African-American directed and about urban life and, have various levels of violence in them. And with each one of those, the newspaper critics, the magazine critics were like, oh, there's going to be riots, so it was like this automatic assumption that if you represent in racial inequality or sort of, have racially charged aggression in the film, that is going to make particularly young African-American audiences commit real acts of violence. And that's why I included the one quote from the reviewer, Joe Klein, that is extremely problematic, but unfortunately was somewhat typical of the reception this film got when it came out, which is that liberal white audiences are going to be able to think about this, in this nuanced way that we're talking about it right now, that there are all these different opinions or whatever. Young Black teenagers are just going to watch this movie and just get angry and go out and do something, right? So it's an incredibly problematic assumption, but it was not unique to Spike Lee's film, right? It also happened to these other prominent African American directed films that had come or that came a couple years later. So yeah, so I think it's some sort of, I mean, obviously there was crime, right? So I'm not saying there wasn't crime, but there was also some I think media hysteria, and there were not riots, this one or Boys in the Hood.
I think I don't think it's entirely fair to say that the film didn't get, and I'm not saying you said this, Amy, but I think Ben sort of hinted at this in his comment, that the film didn't get, critical recognition. Both both Siskel and Ebert, who Roger Ebert would, they were viewed, they had a TV show, true, and that thumb gimmick, but they were, particularly Roger Ebert, but they were both viewed as very serious film critics, identified Do the Right Thing as the best film of its year. They put it on their top 10 lists for the decade of the 1980s. As Amy mentioned in her introduction, it was immediately welcomed into the Library of Congress via the National Film Registry in its first year of eligibility, and it was nominated for an Oscar for Best Original Screenplay. Now, I will say that is not the same as a Best Picture nomination. That is not the same as a Best Director nomination. On the other side of the coin, back then, there were only 5 films that were nominated for Best Picture. And the other thing I would say is if you think that in 2011 or 2012, the Oscars were so white and so old, how white and old do you think they were in 1989 and 1990? So the fact that this movie was nominated for Best Original Screenplay, which is often the sort of, consolation prize given to filmmakers that are too controversial or intense for Hollywood, be it Quentin Tarantino, or in for some of their films, the Coen brothers, although not recently, for Spike Lee to have received that nomination for his first studio picture does show that at least some members of the industry were willing to give the film some of the recognition that it deserved. And there were a number of critics groups that thought very highly of the film and nominated it in their year-end awards. So, I don't think people at the time recognized it as, as the really sort of indelible work that it is seen as now. But I also think that that's true with a lot of movies in general, no matter who makes them or no matter what, sort of story they tell or what sort of people they depict. So I don't think it's, I don't think it got as much recognition as it should have, but it wasn't totally ignored either.
Yeah. And thank you for providing that counter, which is also why I put the other review quote in there, because I did want to show that there was a variety. So yeah, I didn't want to come across it that all of the mainstream film critics were criticizing it. It feels like it's pretty bifurcated, right? There was like, it's genius, or it's, an incoherent mess, and or it's a provocation, right? So I think that there was both. And yeah, and I mean, I think in general, the Academy Awards, especially for Best Picture, like Andrew's saying, they tend to be conservative artistically. They're not picking out the sort of most artistically innovative films of the year. And, they're picking crowd pleasers. They're well done films, but not ones that are, that sort of,
they don't typically push the envelope, right? And this film isn't only doing that in its content or ideology or message, it's doing it in its techniques and its aesthetic. And that's part of what makes it great. But think about how relatively limited the cinematic world of most audiences was in 1989 compared to today, when we have Netflix and Canopy, and we have access to so many other things from so many other periods and countries and cultures. I could imagine this movie being, a challenge for a lot of audiences, and as it obviously was, unfortunately, for some critics who probably should have known better if that's going to be their job. You know, it was a different world, sort of on all sides of things. Let's see, Levi, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to spend more time on Raheem's death, especially because some comments that you made, and also because the scene of his murder, he's literally hung. We see his feet off of the ground, and then he comes to a standstill. And I just want to take a moment to think about that. But also thinking of comparing his death and the loss of a human being to the loss of property, specifically a white man's property, and how Black people were once in a time in America white men's property, and thinking about how would the loss of property be different if the life was property, making the comparison of a life versus property loss, when sometimes in history those were the same thing. I just can't help but think about how representative that is to the entirety history of America, and how things have changed very little, specifically because Raheem is killed by the police. And you could also say he's lynched. There's a huge group of police. They come after him. He was choking Sal, but we are led to believe that Sal's son called the police. I think, coming from someone who was not alive in the time period that this movie was released, but has lived for the last 20 years, seeing what has happened in my lifetime, seeing how little has changed can be really hard, but also seeing that people have been saying something for so long, and why has it taken so long for people to listen? I think these are all questions that flew through my head, but I definitely wanted to take time to think about the loss of Raheem.
Well, thank you for that, Levi. And you're absolutely right. And not only do you want us to think about it, not only does Lee want us to think about it, both clearly within the film and from the comments he's made for decades after, but one of those moments that sort of breaks from the mode of narrative filmmaking, when different people in the neighborhood, after Raheem has been murdered, sort of say the name of another victim of police violence from that time in New York City. The names of those folks are also listed at the end of the film, and you know, some of those names jumped out at me. I grew up in the greater New York area during that time, and I remember hearing some of those names and seeing some of those names on the news, and to see the result, one of the few constructive results in that aftermath being this film, it really sort of brought me back to that time. And you're right. I mean, he wants us to focus on that and to remember that, both within the character within the film and the real people that are referenced. And he takes sort of his filmmaking capital at the moment, in the movie, when audiences are probably the most gripped to remind us of those people. And that's a choice. He would have known how, he would have known the opportunity he had with the audience's attention at that moment, and that's what he uses it for. And it's clearly an important part of the endeavor for him.
Yeah,
Amy,
Andrew, actually, I was going to say what you just said about the calling out of the other names links back to what I think it was you said earlier in terms of sort of an oral history. It's like the community is remembering, and the community is making sure that the younger people won't forget. And so, it's similar to the sort of the musical montage that the DJ does, which, takes Black music from all different decades and genres, that represents, histories. sort of, he does this roll call. And so that's, I think, an oral history moment, as well as what you're talking about, Andrew, at the end. And I feel like I was going to say something else, but I think, getting back, I think, to Levi's really thoughtful response, and suggesting like the idea of lynching, as well as the chokehold, which we know has killed real people, and Eric Garner being the most obvious one that was caught on cell phone video. And then I mentioned that Lee made this montage that cuts back and forth between Radio Raheem being strangled and the real person, Eric Garner, being strangled. So he absolutely wants us to make those connections. But then, when you said lynching, then I thought, yeah, okay, that's also history, of course. And your ideas about property are really interesting as well, because of course, Sal and his family are making money off of the community, right? So they're not directly owning people, but Mookie is at Sal's beck and call, and and obviously their livelihood is being made off of the people in the neighborhood. So I think all of those historical echoes are definitely there, and so I'm really glad you brought that up.
Janice, you have a question or comment?
Yes, I think that any person who has ever owned a business would look at some of the comments at this stage differently. Anyone who had worked their whole life to have a store like he did and put his blood, sweat, and tears in it, and his son was watching that, would call the police. They didn't kill him, Radio Raheem, directly. They called the police. We're right back to where we are today, and perhaps that's being pointed out as well, which is we depend on the police and hope and expect, at least at that time, I would have thought, that they would come and have stopped it, not that they would have come and killed him. I mean, if I saw my father being choked, I would call the police. I don't think that's an unreasonable thing for him to have done. And I don't think that Spike Lee was suggesting that it was an unreasonable thing. I think he was showing us how things get out of hand, asking us to look at what some of the other options would have been anywhere along the way. But when we make a dichotomy between property and life, it isn't a dichotomy. Both of them have a right. They have a right to their life, and people have a right to the property that they amassed in a whole lifetime. And the comment that was just made about that they were living off of the Black community, he stayed when other people left. So I don't look at it as living off the Black community. I think the people that stayed were, of course, doing it for their own benefit, but they were also helping the community as well. So
No,
I think
you're absolutely right, Janice. And I mean, there are a number of characters in the movie who say as much, right? When Buggenou's trying to get people to join him in the boycott, you've got the group, I guess they're supposed to be teenagers, the group of teenagers that includes Martin Lawrence and others. Buggenou tries to get them to join him in the boycott, and they're sort of like, "Are you crazy? I was raised on that. I'm going to go get a slice now. That's good food, all that stuff." And so, there is a diversity of opinion on that single question too. You're absolutely right, and that's, I mean, society is a series of trade-offs, and I mean, that is what commerce is Sal needs them and they need him, and the real sort of, and that's a completely valid point, and that's how the world works. But on the other side of things, Sal's providing a service, and he's making money from the community, and he seems to have some respect for the community. But as different moments in the film show us, And certainly that final conflagration, he doesn't have sufficient respect for the community, as it turns out. Not that that justifies necessarily what happens to him, but I have to disagree that, you know, I think we all tell ourselves, and we all, you know, tell our kids that if the choice is an object or a person, no matter how expensive or elaborate or rare the object is, you choose the person. And I think you're right to say that it was reasonable for them to call the police, and that the expectation needs to be on the police and city governments to exercise the monopoly on violence that they have with much more judiciously than they certainly did in this case, and than they have in many recent cases. But the alternative to them calling the police is them trying to engage in force directly, and I guess we don't want that either, right? So I mean, this whole line of discussion is just a further indication of the awareness of the complexities that Lee has of the situation, and how he's able to put them into the film, which is a really impressive achievement. Amy, did you have any other comments?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, I think that Janice's point, you know, is just another way of reinforcing that Spike Lee doesn't think there is a right thing, right? That title itself is this challenge, and that there's all of these different perspectives. And even in that moment, somebody, and I know I'm forgetting who it is, I mean, it might have been DeMayer. I don't know who's that, that actually says, you know, well, Sal didn't kill Radio Raheem, it was the police, right? So you do, I think, have recognition within the film that that the violence is coming from the police. On the other hand, we can, and I think a couple people have been saying this in the chat, we can imagine that Sal is going to feel a lot more comfortable calling the police than maybe an African-American resident of the neighborhood, right? So that Sal is, I'm sure, aware that his whiteness would cause him to be treated differently than especially somebody who appears like Radio Raheem, right? Radio Raheem is constructed as a character deliberately to look threatening, and to sort of play on some racist fears. As well as annoy people of the same race, as I said before, right? That like not everybody in the neighborhood like necessarily enjoys him. But the other thing, I guess, that I like to think of in terms of the ending and Mookie's choice is, again, the film is allegorical in some ways. It's realistic in some ways, but it is also a sort of morality tale, and everything represents something. So you can think of it not necessarily as Mookie as an individual person who's like, you know, smashing up his employer's establishment, but Mookie as making this symbolic gesture that is sort of channeling, you know, decades and generations of anger, and economic disempowerment, you know, lack of access to capital, inability to buy property, all of those things that have led up to the situation of a lot of people in the neighborhood. And so, you know, rather, because this isn't nonfiction, right? It's fiction. So reading it as fiction, and particularly as allegorical fiction, then you can say, you know, Mookie is making a symbolic gesture against a particular system of capitalism that has excluded African Americans, and then, you know, the racialized policing, right? So yeah, so I guess I would just suggest also that perhaps we read it allegorically rather than as, you know, if we really knew Mookie and Sal as people, then we would feel bad that he did that, right?
Right. Just like if I really knew Sal as a person, I would feel bad that he, you know, used the N-word after seeming to be, you know, more sensible than that. But he's not a person. He's a representative in what you said, I think, very, you know, thoughtfully, as an allegory, and the film, you know, is relatively clear about that, although not, I think, in a sort of heavy-handed way. The other thing I think is interesting is that, you know, I think it's easy to imagine that Mookie felt like he had to make a choice, right? That he was seen as sort of with a foot in both worlds, right? Because he worked for the pizzeria, but he was obviously African American and lived in the neighborhood, and he felt like he had to choose one side or the other when, and perhaps part of the point of the film, or one of the things we're meant to take away from the film, is that you don't necessarily, people are complicated and people are complex, and they have multiple motivations and beliefs and passions, and Mookie felt he had to choose a side, but maybe he didn't even have to choose one side. And maybe if he hadn't chosen a side, one or the other, that might have led to things going down differently. But I think that in and of itself, it was a really, it's a bold decision. And particularly, Lee had to have known that there would have been extra sort of criticism heaped on him as the writer, director, producer, having his character be the one to do it. But he did it anyway, because it fit for the story he wanted to tell and the messages he wanted to convey. And that was a bold choice, particularly at the time. Let's see. William, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I wanted to, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, I wanted to first thank Amy for just acknowledging some of the things I posted earlier. This is my first time asking a question, so I'm a little shy. And we're far from that subject we were talking about before, but I really like kind of what Levi had said, and I think it brings to mind what hits me is, well, first I want to say kind of wow when she brought up the point that in classes that people are more upset about a place burning down rather than a life. I kind of stand back and I go like, wow, and it does say a lot. It just makes me think of a statement which often I'm challenged by of if we could put in the words of the movie of it was to say it two ways. It was horrible that they killed Radio Raheem, but they shouldn't have burnt the place down, versus saying it's horrible they burnt the place down, but they shouldn't have killed Radio Raheem. Those two statements have slightly different meanings and connotations. And I think it challenges people to look at things in light of what we saw. And it doesn't minimize or mitigate the importance of both, because neither one is right, but it just does, in a way, to me, show you where maybe your priority is, perhaps, or maybe your view or opinion. Well, I don't know. It's controversial, but you know what I'm saying?
But Willie, I see your point, and I think the nuance of the differences between those two statements is very interesting to think about in light of the film. The only thing I will say to push back just a tiny, tiny bit is that when people reference Raheem's murder first and then the burning down, that's the order that Lee depicted those events in the film. And that too was a choice, right? And perhaps it was a choice that we've been talking about Lee sort of, challenging the audience and testing the audience and things like that. And maybe that was part of that, right? And we'll never know. It's a counterfactual, right? We'll never know what the reception would have been from any audiences if, for whatever reason, there had been a destruction at the pizzeria, and then the police came after the destruction started, and then Raheem's murder was the last sort of, violent act. I don't know if it would have changed people's perception, and I don't know if it would have made those questions that Lee gets, that people come up to him or that Amy gets in her classes any different. But that is just one point to think about. I don't think it affects the ultimate sort of weight of the two acts, but I do think that it gives it complicates this conversation a little bit.
Oh, I agree. I think, and that's interesting you brought it up, because I never really thought about that, because you're right. Often in many, maybe other movies, that's how we see things. Certain things happen and then that happens, usually not the reverse. And it's just interesting to think about that.
I mean, that's one of the challenges, I'm sorry, of narrative cinema, right? I mean, it's so much conditions us to think about a chain of cause and effect events. And, one of the great things about this movie, and one of the things most appropriate for the subjects it's discussing, but also one of the things that makes it such a challenge to studios and to the industry and to audiences and to the academy is that it doesn't have that clarity and that neatness and that containment that the vast majority, particularly in up until the 1980s, of Hollywood movies had. And that sort of narrative chain is part of that tradition, and it's something that I think Lee is working with as one of the tools in his toolbox as a filmmaker.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's interesting. Excuse the pun, but it's almost like he says things aren't so black and white. In a way, that's because there is so much. It's not just like a, one or the other, like right or wrong. There is so much to think about, and even the reference before, we were talking about people being diverse, like we talked about Sal explosion and doing the thing he did and breaking the radio. It's like, it seems so out of normal, but I often want to say is like, it is some of that underlying stuff that this is a film. I think filmmakers often make things bigger than normal because it's symbolic, it's thematic. So
Right.
yeah, maybe his scene seems that's out of the ordinary, but Lee wants to make a point. He's putting an exclamation point, like, and I draw a reference to like a modern movie like Get Out, where the seemingly non-racist white people are really not so non-racist.
Right.
So I find that it's amazing how his film just lives on and on years later. Thank you for taking my point.
Sure. Thank you, William.
Yeah, thank you, William. If I could just, I want to make sure that I haven't thrown my students under the bus here. So I just want to clarify what I said about my experiences teaching this. I don't think that if you ask my students directly, like, which is more important, a person's life or right, they would obviously be like, the person's life. But it's more that, again, what we've been talking about, the way that Lee constructs the characters and gives us so much intimacy with Sal that we do not have with Radio Raheem, that just ends up being, like, I think emotionally what a lot of them are drawn to. But it's, I think, again, that is sort of the power of the emotion of the film. And one other, I'll just throw out one other critic's point of view on Mookie's choice, is about diversion. So one critic has argued, a scholar of Spike Lee has argued, that what Mookie does represents redirecting violence towards property instead of Sal and his sons, right? So that if the crowd is so angry at the police violence, and you got to remember, this is not an isolated incident of police violence, right? This is a community that has experienced generations of either, police violence or vigilante violence. And so, from their point of view, Sal calling the police has led to another killing, but not the first one. So we have to remember that historical context that the African-American community is feeling. And so that perhaps then Mookie is saying, something's going to happen here, right? So there's going to be some violence. And is it better to direct the violence at the pizza parlor versus Sal and his son? So just to throw out another interpretation.
That's a brilliant point, and a dimension that I'm sure a lot of people, doesn't occur to a lot of people, that it could actually be. And Sal probably doesn't realize this, and you wonder if maybe driving home, it ever dawns on him, even years later, would it ever dawn on Sal that Mookie destroyed his life's work, but he and his sons get to walk away. And that really can change your whole perspective of the end of the film. That's really interesting. Anna, you had another comment.
Yeah, so I just wanted to take a moment to note one of Lee's visual or sensory tools with the heat throughout the film, and his use of vibrant reds, and even he uses like a space heater like in front of the camera during some scenes, so you can see the heat waves and how that heat is symbolic of the kind of mounting racial tension, and it eventually culminates in the climax of the film with an actual fire. And I was wondering if, when we kind of shift our lens as the destruction of Sal's Pizzeria as a result of all of that culminating tension, heat, and histories of violence, as a result of that, rather than as a result of a singular, instance of, senseless violence against a Black man, if it becomes, it becomes more approachable and understandable and almost justified, the destruction of Sal's pizza shop, because we see that it's not just a single moment of violence, it's a culminating, generations and just over the course of the day, a culminating tension, if that makes any sense.
No, I think you're right. I mean, Lee and particularly cinematographer Ernest Dickerson talk about how important giving the audience that sense of the heat was. And they work with the production designer and Ruth Carter, the costume designer, of course, to help convey that. And I think you're right, but I think it's not only the heat. I mean, Lee's telling us this is a culmination. When the people in the street mention the names of those other victims, I mean, we know historically at this moment, and if we would have known in 1989 that this was representative of far too many incidents like this, and I think the heat just is another ingredient into that cauldron. Absolutely. Let's see, with our last comment, Lee, are you there?
Yes, I'm still here. I think that what he so brilliantly portrays is like a perfect storm. The way the tension builds, and in the end, it's not clear what causes what. But both Sal's destruction of the radio is a sudden explosive burst. The same way that Mookie throwing the trash can is something that's unexpected. You didn't see that kind of violence or that in him before, but these unexpected conflagration of events produces explosive things that are somewhat unpredictable. And I thought this was brilliantly portrayed. One other thing I wanted to mention is in terms of the police, who were certainly a character in the scene repeatedly, was I believe that one of the other policemen was trying to tell him to stop.
Yeah.
The first time I saw the movie, I didn't hear that.
Yeah. Thank you, Lee. Yeah. Danny Aiello's son, Rick, is the taller blonde cop who's actually choking Raheem, and Miguel Sandoval plays his partner, and his partner is trying to tell him to stop. It's too much.
He says he's trying, which again is a replay of
the
way these things
sometimes
happen so often. But it's an astonishingly sophisticated depiction of how these outbursts and tragedies happen.
You're absolutely right, Lee. Thank you so much. I think your first point about how, what is the spark that sets off the powder keg? How far back do you go in the chain of events to try to get to the root cause, to try to place blame, to try and, justify actions? If this person hadn't done this, if that person hadn't done that, how far back can you go? I mean, it's just another way, as you were saying, Lee, how Spike Lee, shows us how complicated these things can be.
In the context of relationships that were not entirely antagonistic before.
Right. Thank you. Amy, do you have any last thoughts or comments?
I was actually just gonna, because I know we're pretty much out of time, but there were a long time ago in the chat, there was a question or a mention of the Korean American couple, and then there was one very recently also that I was from Joss about the mob holding itself back from the Korean grocery. So I won't sort of say that in depth or talk about that in depth, but I think it's worth at least mentioning that we haven't explored that, and that I think that there's another layer of ambiguity there, right? Where at the end, and I forget the character's name, but the male Korean American owner of the store, tries to ally himself with the African American community. And then earlier it's like, well, they get to own a business here, we don't get, and so that ambiguity is there when you're talking about two non-white groups interacting with each other. And so there's a lot more to say about that. And there's, the LA riots that happened after, Rodney King was beaten, and that was caught on video. Then there was a lot of tension with, and I believe it was Korean American, but certainly Asian American run stores that were vandalized. So that reflects a reality, and also the complexity of a multiracial community, so that it's not just black, white. There's actually, people who are of different races and cultures and are sort of navigating the American polarity of black and white in different ways.
Yeah. I mean, it's just a further indication of, we could have gone on for another hour at least about this film, and we can't touch on everything. And it's again an element of credit to Spike Lee for packing so much into his 2-hour film, and his first studio film at that. It's also an indication, Amy, of how lucky we were to have your introduction that provided some much needed context to the film before we all watched and discussed it. So Amy, thank you very much for joining us. And thank all of you for joining us for this discussion. If this was the first time you've joined us, we do a lot of online film education while the Institute is currently closed. We have a number of seminars coming up, including one tomorrow night. There's still a few spots left. Tomorrow night's seminar taught by Paul Wright on the films of Jordan Peele. We also have a number of other seminars coming up, as you can see on your screen, over the next few months. We hope you'll consider joining us for one of those Tuesday night courses, single session courses. If you like this discussion, we do one of these almost every Monday night. You can find out about them by signing up for our emails. Every Thursday, we send an email telling you what the Monday film to be discussed is, and a link to its introduction as well. We have a host of other content as well, film puzzles, crosswords, mini film lessons. All of those things are free. And we hope that you will join us again for another one of our discussions, or another, perhaps a new film in Theater 5. We have new films that are released only through movie theater websites. So there's a lot going on at brynmarfilm.org. Check out Theater 5, check out Film Studies Online. And if you like what you're doing and you have the means, please consider making a donation to help support us, so we can keep going strong and then hit the ground running when we're ready to reopen. But until then, I thank you for joining us, and hope everybody has a good night. Take care.
Thank you so much for all your thoughtful comments.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Amy.